What you're about to hear is not your typical self-help book. There are no 10-step programs here, no miracle morning routines, no guaranteed systems for becoming a millionaire in 30 days. What you're about to hear is something rarer, and I'd argue far more valuable. It's the distilled thinking of one man, Naval Ravikant, a philosopher-entrepreneur who became wealthy and then decided to spend a good portion of his life figuring out why, and whether any of it even mattered. Naval is the co-founder of AngelList, one of Silicon Valley's most influential platforms. He's an angel investor who backed companies like Twitter, Uber, and Postmates before they were household names. By almost any measure, he has made it. And yet, what makes his thinking so extraordinary isn't his financial success. It's the clarity with which he thinks about how to live. This audiobook is a guided journey through his ideas, drawn from years of tweets, podcasts, essays, and conversations compiled by author Jorgenson into what became one of the most widely shared books on personal philosophy of the last decade. We'll cover two big territories: how to build wealth and how to find happiness. Not wealth as in buy a yacht, wealth as in freedom, the freedom to do what you want, when you want, with whom you want. And happiness not as a mood, but as a skill, a practice, a way of moving through life. We've organized this into sections that follow the arc of Naval's thinking. You can listen straight through or pause after any section and sit with the ideas. The best ideas, Naval would say, are the ones that make you stop and think, not the ones you rush past. So let's begin. Pour yourself something warm, get comfortable, and let's talk about what it really means to build a good life. Who is Naval Ravikant? Before we dive into the ideas, let's spend a moment understanding the man himself, because his background matters. It shapes why he thinks the way he does. Naval was born in New Delhi, India, and moved to the United States as a child. He grew up in New York, largely without privilege. His family wasn't wealthy. He relied on scholarships, public libraries, and an almost obsessive love of reading. He'd later say that books were his first real escape, not from boredom, but into understanding. He read everything he could get his hands on: philosophy, physics, biology, economics, not because he had to, because he genuinely wanted to understand how the world worked. He studied computer science and economics at Dartmouth, then moved to Silicon Valley in the late 1990s, right in the middle of the first internet boom. He made money, he lost money, he got sued, he started companies that failed, he had relationships that fell apart. He went through years of quiet misery, even while appearing successful to the outside world. And then, gradually, through relentless reading, reflection, and a lot of meditation, he started finding his footing. Not just financially, but internally. What makes Naval unusual isn't that he's smart. Silicon Valley is full of smart people. What makes him unusual is that he's honest, brutally, sometimes uncomfortably honest, about the gap between looking successful and actually feeling free. He's also remarkably generous with his thinking. He tweets, he podcasts, he gives interviews, not to build a brand, but because he genuinely believes these ideas matter and should be shared. Jorgenson, who compiled this book, spent years curating Naval's public wisdom into a coherent whole. The result is something that reads less like a business book and more like a quiet conversation with someone who has truly thought deeply about how to live. With that as our foundation, let's move into the first big territory: wealth.
Part 2. Building wealth the right way. What wealth really means. Let's start by getting clear on something, because Naval is very precise with language. When he talks about wealth, he does not mean money. He means assets, things that generate income while you sleep. Think about it this way. If you have a job, you're trading time for money. The moment you stop working, the income stops. That's not wealth, that's employment. Valuable, yes, but not freedom. Wealth, in Naval's framework, is when your assets, your investments, your businesses, your intellectual property generate enough money on their own that you no longer have to sell your time. That's the goal. Naval puts it simply: seek wealth, not money or status. Wealth is having assets that earn while you sleep. This distinction sounds obvious when you hear it, but most people never truly internalize it. They spend their entire careers maximizing their income, getting raises, switching jobs, climbing ladders, without ever building assets. And when the job ends, so does the income. The goal isn't to get a high salary. The goal is to eventually not need one. The ladder: how to get there. So, how do you build wealth? Naval breaks it down into kind of a ladder, a sequence of steps that anyone can climb regardless of where they start. Let's walk through it. The first rung is understanding the basics. In a free market economy, you get rewarded for creating value for other people. That's it. The secret to wealth is finding a way to create value at scale, to help many people at once rather than one person at a time. A doctor who sees patients one-on-one can only scale by working longer hours. A doctor who writes a book, creates a course, or builds a health app can help thousands of people simultaneously. Same expertise, totally different leverage. That's the key insight: leverage. The 3 types of leverage. Naval identifies 3 types of leverage, and understanding them is probably the most practically useful idea in this entire book, so pay attention. The first type of leverage is labor, hiring people to work for you. This is the oldest kind of leverage. Kings had armies, merchants had workers. It still works, but it has real limits. People need to be managed, motivated, and paid. It's messy. The second type is capital, money working for you. If you have $1 million invested at a reasonable return, that money generates income whether you're awake or asleep, working or on vacation. This is more powerful than labor, but it requires you to have capital first, which many people don't. The third type, and this is the one Naval gets most excited about, is products with no marginal cost of replication. Code, media, books, podcasts, algorithms. Things you create once that can be copied and distributed essentially for free, indefinitely. Think about that for a second. If you write a piece of software, it costs roughly the same to run it for one person as for 1 million people. If you record a podcast episode, it costs nothing extra for it to be downloaded 10 million times. If you write a book, this book, for example, it can reach millions of readers without the author writing it again. Naval calls this permissionless leverage. You don't need someone to give you a job. You don't need investors to give you capital. You just need to create something valuable and put it into the world. Code and media are permissionless leverage. They're the leverage behind the current richest people in the world, and not many people are taking advantage of it. This is why so many of the world's new wealthy are founders of tech companies and media empires. They figured out how to create once and distribute infinitely. Specific knowledge, your unfair advantage. Now, here's the question. What should you create? What should you build? What should you offer the world? Naval's answer is built around a concept he calls specific knowledge, and it's one of the most useful frameworks I've come across for thinking about career and value. Specific knowledge is not what you learn in school. It's not a degree or a certification. It's the combination of your unique experiences, your obsessions, your way of seeing the world, things that come naturally to you but feel difficult or mysterious to others. It's the kind of knowledge that cannot be easily taught or replicated. It's what happens when your genuine curiosity, the stuff you'd pursue even if no one paid you, intersects with real-world demand. Naval gives a vivid example.
If you grew up fascinated by video games, not just playing them, but understanding how they work, what makes them fun, how the economics of game design function, that knowledge is incredibly specific. Most people don't have it. And in a world where gaming is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry, that knowledge can be extraordinarily valuable. Specific knowledge is found by pursuing your genuine curiosity and passion rather than chasing whatever is hot right now. Here's what that means practically. Don't try to figure out what skills are in demand and then acquire them. That's a losing game. The market moves faster than your ability to retrain. Instead, look at what you're already obsessed with. What do you read for fun? What problems do you find yourself thinking about in the shower? What could you talk about for hours without getting tired? That intersection, your obsession plus real-world value, is where specific knowledge lives. And, importantly, specific knowledge, by definition, can't be easily outsourced or automated. If a machine can do it, it's not specific knowledge, it's a commodity. The more unique your combination of skills and experience, the harder you are to replace. Play long-term games with long-term people. Naval has a wonderful phrase, play long-term games with long-term people. What does this mean? It means that most of the real wealth creation in the world, and most of the real happiness for that matter, comes from compounding. Not just financial compounding, but relationship compounding, knowledge compounding, reputation compounding. Think of trust like compound interest. When you work with someone once, there's friction. You're figuring each other out, calibrating expectations, building understanding. But if you work with them again and again and again, that friction disappears. You know their strengths, they know yours. You stop wasting energy on politics and performance, and you start actually creating things together. The best business partnerships last decades. The best friendships last lifetimes. These aren't accidents. They're the result of both parties choosing to invest in the relationship over time. This also has a practical implication for how you pick your collaborators. When you're deciding whether to work with someone, as a business partner, an employee, a co-founder, don't just ask, are they skilled? Ask, do they have integrity? Do they have good judgment? Would I want to be around them for 10 years? The people you commit to will shape who you become. Choose carefully. Be the best in the world at something. Here's a slightly uncomfortable but deeply liberating idea from Naval. He says, figure out what you can be the best in the world at and do that. Now, before you dismiss this as absurdly ambitious, let me explain what he means by the world. The Internet has redefined what a market is. Once upon a time, the best accountant in the world was maybe the best one in your city. Information couldn't travel. Talent couldn't scale. But now, with the Internet, you're competing in a global market, and you have access to a global audience. That means you don't need to be the best accountant in general. You need to be the best accountant for a very specific kind of client with a very specific problem, communicated in a very specific way. The specificity is what makes it achievable. The best podcast about vintage synthesizers. The best newsletter about medieval history, the best coach for first-generation immigrants starting businesses. These are all things you could plausibly be the best in the world at because you've defined the world narrowly enough that excellence is within reach. And here's the thing, being the best in that niche rewards you disproportionately. In a winner-take-most world, which the Internet largely is, there's a massive difference between being first and being second. Accountability and risk. There's another piece of the wealth puzzle that Naval emphasizes, and it's one that most people instinctively avoid. Accountability. He says, take on accountability under your own name. What he means is this: put your name on your work. Don't hide behind a corporation or anonymity.
take the risk of being publicly responsible for what you create. This feels scary, and it is a little, but the upside is enormous. When you operate under your own name, you build a reputation. Reputation is one of the most powerful forms of leverage there is. A good reputation means that opportunities come to you, rather than you chasing them.
People trust you. They recommend you. They give you the benefit of the doubt in ambiguous situations. Naval points out that companies and creators who truly break through almost always have strong personal brands attached. Think of Elon Musk and Tesla, or Oprah and her media empire, or Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. The personal accountability amplifies the institutional brand. The risk of taking on accountability is also, paradoxically, what filters out competition. Most people won't put their name on anything controversial or risky, which means the field is far less crowded for those who will. How to find your path to wealth. So, let's bring this together. Here's Naval's rough roadmap. First, identify your specific knowledge, the things you know that most people don't, rooted in your genuine curiosity and experience. Second, figure out how to apply that knowledge with leverage, ideally code or media, where you create once and distribute infinitely. Third, take on accountability. Put your name on your work, build a reputation. Fourth, play long-term games. Invest in relationships, in skills, in assets. Give compounding time to work. And fifth, and Naval is very clear on this, be patient. Real wealth is not built quickly. The people who get rich fast usually lose it fast. The people who build lasting wealth do so over decades through consistent, compounding effort. You're not going to get rich renting out your time. You must own equity, a piece of a business, to gain your financial freedom. That doesn't necessarily mean starting a company, by the way. It might mean negotiating equity in the company you work for. It might mean investing in index funds. It might mean building a side project with intellectual property that generates passive income. The form matters less than the principle. Own something that generates value without requiring your constant presence.
Think for yourself, radically. Wealth, in Naval's framework, isn't just about tactics. It's about how you think. And the first mental tool he advocates for is something almost radical: thinking for yourself. We live in an age of unprecedented information and unprecedented noise. Everyone has an opinion. Every platform is designed to tell you what to think, feel, and believe. The average person is bombarded with other people's mental frameworks from the moment they wake up to the moment they fall asleep. Naval's prescription is almost ascetic. Do less of that. Read more. Think more. Argue less online. Spend more time with your own thoughts. He's a fierce advocate for what he calls first principles thinking, starting from the ground up, from fundamental truths, rather than accepting conventional wisdom. Instead of asking, what do most people believe about X? Ask, what do I actually know about X? What's provably true? What can I build from there? This is hard. It's genuinely uncomfortable to question assumptions that everyone around you holds, but it's where the real insights live. I don't believe I have the ability to pick stocks. I don't believe I can time the market. I believe I can identify areas where there's a lot of innovation happening and try to be there. Notice what Naval is doing here. He's not following conventional financial wisdom. He's not pretending to know things he doesn't know. He's being honest about his actual capabilities and operating within them. That's first principles thinking in action. The value of reading. If there's one habit Naval returns to again and again, it's reading. Not reading for productivity, not reading to collect information, reading to understand. He has a wonderfully liberating approach to books. He refuses to finish ones that aren't speaking to him. Life is too short to spend it reading books out of obligation.
The goal is to find the books that feel almost electric, where every page opens a new door in your mind, and read those obsessively. He prioritizes certain categories above others: science, mathematics, philosophy, economics, the foundational disciplines that underpin everything else. He suggests getting deeply fluent in one area at a time, not just surface-level familiar, but genuinely understanding the underlying models. His reading advice is counterintuitive in another way too. Reread. The books that matter most to you will reveal different things at different stages of your life. The book you read at 20 will mean something entirely different at 40. Don't rush to acquire new books at the expense of deeply understanding the great ones. The genuine love of reading is probably the most valuable skill you can have if you want to self-educate. He also reads broadly across disciplines. This is deliberate. When you understand biology and economics and physics and philosophy, you start seeing the same patterns appearing across completely different fields. That cross-disciplinary vision is where some of the most original insights come from. Mental models, the toolkit for clear thinking. A mental model is a simplified framework that helps you understand and navigate a complex situation. Naval is a collector of mental models, borrowed from economics, biology, physics, and psychology. Let's talk about a few of the most important ones he advocates. First, the concept of principal-agent problems. This is borrowed from economics. A principal is the person who wants something done. An agent is the person hired to do it. The problem? The agent's interests don't always align with the principal's. Think of a real estate agent. They want to close a deal quickly so they can collect their commission. You, the buyer or seller, want to maximize your outcome, which might mean waiting for a better deal. Same transaction, different incentives. This misalignment is everywhere in business, investing, and management. When you understand principal-agent problems, you start asking better questions. Whenever you're getting advice from someone, ask yourself, what are their incentives? What do they gain from steering me in a particular direction? Second, the concept of compounding. We already talked about this in the context of wealth, but Naval extends it everywhere. Knowledge compounds, skills compound, relationships compound, health compounds. The actions you take today, learning, exercising, maintaining integrity, pay dividends that grow exponentially over time. The flip side is also true. Bad habits compound, debt compounds, damaged relationships compound. Every day you delay starting something that matters is a day of compounding you lose. Third, the idea of leverage points. In any complex system, a business, a family, a political situation, there are a few key points where a small change produces enormous effects. Great thinkers and leaders spend their time identifying those leverage points rather than getting lost in the noise of things that don't fundamentally matter. Judgment is the most valuable skill. Of all the mental skills, Naval says the most valuable one, the one that ultimately determines your outcomes more than anything else, is judgment. Judgment is the ability to make good decisions with incomplete information under conditions of uncertainty with real consequences. It's not knowledge, it's not intelligence, it's wisdom. And wisdom is earned, not taught. Good judgment comes from experience, and experience, as the old saying goes, usually comes from bad judgment. You learn by making mistakes, reflecting honestly on them, and adjusting. Naval also says something counterintuitive about information. Having more of it doesn't automatically improve judgment. In fact, information overload can degrade judgment by introducing noise, false patterns, and cognitive fatigue. The people with the best judgment, he observes, are often the ones who are very selective about what information they consume. This is why he emphasizes deep reading over surface browsing. Reading a good book slowly gives you time to think, to disagree, to question. Scrolling through news feeds is the opposite, a fire hose of disconnected facts designed to trigger reactions, not reflection. To improve judgment, Naval recommends think in writing, read constantly, talk to people who disagree with you intelligently, and, most importantly, spend time alone with your thoughts. Silence is underrated as a thinking tool.
We've spent a lot of time in the world of wealth and work, Now we're going to shift gears entirely and talk about what might be the harder problem, happiness. Naval would say that wealth without happiness is a hollow achievement. He's seen it, he's lived it in periods of his own life. You can be wealthy, successful, admired, and still feel an undercurrent of anxiety, restlessness, or quiet despair. So what is happiness, and how do you find it? Or more precisely, how do you build it? Naval's answer is unconventional. He doesn't talk about positive thinking. He doesn't recommend gratitude journals or vision boards. He goes much deeper into philosophy, neuroscience, and what he calls the science of the self. Happiness is a skill, not a state. The first and most important thing Naval says about happiness is this: it's not something that happens to you, it's something you practice. We tend to think of happiness as a reaction to external circumstances. Good things happen, we feel happy. Bad things happen, we feel unhappy. The goal, we think, is to arrange for more good things and fewer bad things. But Naval argues, drawing on both ancient philosophy and modern neuroscience, that this is backwards. Our emotional state is primarily determined not by what happens to us, but by our habitual patterns of thinking about what happens to us. The technical term for this in psychology is hedonic adaptation, the tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of positive or negative events. You get the promotion, you feel great for a few weeks, and then you're back to normal. You lose the job, you feel terrible for a while, and then you adapt. The circumstances changed, the baseline didn't. Naval's insight is that you can actually shift the baseline, but only by working on the internal patterns, not the external circumstances. Happiness is a skill in the sense that it requires practice, discipline, and the willingness to examine your own mind honestly. Happiness is the state when nothing is missing. When nothing is missing, your mind shuts down and stops running into the past or future to regret something or plan something. The root of unhappiness. Naval is blunt about what creates unhappiness. He says most of our suffering comes from one source, desire. Now, this isn't a call to become a monk and want nothing. It's a more nuanced observation. The problem isn't wanting things, it's the habit of tying your sense of peace and okayness to whether you have them. Think about it. When you want something very badly, a job, a relationship, a certain outcome, you're in a state of perpetual incompleteness. You're okay only when you get the thing. And then, once you get it, the feeling fades and you need the next thing. This is a treadmill, and it's entirely internal. The world doesn't do this to you. Your mind does this to you. Naval borrows from Stoic philosophy and Buddhist thought here. Both traditions, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, arrived at the same conclusion. Suffering comes from the gap between what is and what we want to be. Reduce that gap, not by getting everything you want, but by learning to want less urgently, and suffering decreases. This is not passivity. Naval is one of the most driven people alive. You can be ambitious and still be at peace. The key is to be driven by genuine curiosity and love of the work, rather than by anxiety about outcomes. The monkey mind and how to quiet it. There's a wonderful concept in Buddhist thought called the monkey mind, the restless, chattering internal narrator that jumps from thought to thought, worry to worry, plan to plan, regret to regret. Sound familiar? That's most of our inner life, most of the time. We're rarely fully present. We're usually somewhere else, replaying a past conversation, rehearsing a future one, worrying about things that may never happen. Naval says this is the single biggest source of human suffering, not circumstances, not other people, the monkey mind. And the antidote, the thing he returns to again and again, is meditation. He's been meditating for years, but his approach is different from what you might expect. He doesn't follow a rigid technique. He sits quietly and just watches what his mind does. He notices thoughts arising and passing. He doesn't try to suppress them or redirect them. He just observes. This practice, which sounds simple but is genuinely difficult, gradually trains you to create distance between you and your thoughts. You stop being the thoughts. You start becoming the observer of the thoughts. And that shift, however subtle it sounds, changes everything. Meditation is turning off society's mind and listening to your own. He also says something unexpected. You can meditate without sitting still. A long walk alone, without a podcast or music, is a form of meditation. Doing the dishes without distraction is a form of meditation. Anything that brings you fully into the present moment with full awareness counts. The goal isn't to empty your mind. The goal is to stop being controlled by it.
We spent a lot of time in the world of wealth and work. Now we're going to shift gears entirely and talk about what might be the harder problem: happiness. Naval would say that wealth without happiness is a hollow achievement. He's seen it, he's lived it in periods of his own life. You can be wealthy, successful, admired, and still feel an undercurrent of anxiety, restlessness, or quiet despair. So what is happiness, and how do you find it? Or, more precisely, how do you build it? Naval's answer is unconventional. He doesn't talk about positive thinking. He doesn't recommend gratitude journals or vision boards. He goes much deeper into philosophy, neuroscience, and what he calls the science of the self. Happiness is a skill, not a state. The first and most important thing Naval says about happiness is this: it's not something that happens to you, it's something you practice. We tend to think of happiness as a reaction to external circumstances. Good things happen, we feel happy. Bad things happen, we feel unhappy. The goal, we think, is to arrange for more good things and fewer bad things. But Naval argues, drawing on both ancient philosophy and modern neuroscience, that this is backwards. Our emotional state is primarily determined not by what happens to us, but by our habitual patterns of thinking about what happens to us. The technical term for this in psychology is hedonic adaptation, the tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of positive or negative events. You get the promotion, you feel great for a few weeks, and then you're back to normal. You lose the job, you feel terrible for a while, and then you adapt. The circumstances changed, the baseline didn't. Naval's insight is that you can actually shift the baseline, but only by working on the internal patterns, not the external circumstances. Happiness is a skill, in the sense that it requires practice, discipline, and the willingness to examine your own mind honestly. Happiness is the state when nothing is missing. When nothing is missing, your mind shuts down and stops running into the past or future to regret something or to plan something. The root of unhappiness. Naval is blunt about what creates unhappiness. He says most of our suffering comes from one source: desire. Now, this isn't a call to become a monk and want nothing. It's a more nuanced observation. The problem isn't wanting things. It's the habit of tying your sense of peace and okayness to whether you have them. Think about it. When you want something very badly, a job, a relationship, a certain outcome, you're in a state of perpetual incompleteness. You're okay only when you get the thing. And then, once you get it, the feeling fades, and you need the next thing. This is a treadmill, and it's entirely internal. The world doesn't do this to you. Your mind does this to you. Naval borrows from Stoic philosophy and Buddhist thought here. Both traditions, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, arrived at the same conclusion. Suffering comes from the gap between what is and what we want to be. Reduce that gap, not by getting everything you want, but by learning to want less urgently, and suffering decreases. This is not passivity. Naval is one of the most driven people alive.
You can be ambitious and still be at peace. The key is to be driven by genuine curiosity and love of the work, rather than by anxiety about outcomes. The monkey mind and how to quiet it. There's a wonderful concept in Buddhist thought called the monkey mind, the restless, chattering internal narrator that jumps from thought to thought, worry to worry, plan to plan, regret to regret. Sound familiar? That's most of our inner life, most of the time. We're rarely fully present. We're usually somewhere else, replaying a past conversation, rehearsing a future one, worrying about things that may never happen. Naval says this is the single biggest source of human suffering, not circumstances, not other people, the monkey mind. And the antidote, the thing he returns to again and again, is meditation. He's been meditating for years, but his approach is different from what you might expect. He doesn't follow a rigid technique. He sits quietly and just watches what his mind does. He notices thoughts arising and passing. He doesn't try to suppress them or redirect them. He just observes. This practice, which sounds simple but is genuinely difficult, gradually trains you to create distance between you and your thoughts. You stop being the thoughts. You start becoming the observer of the thoughts. And that shift, however subtle it sounds, changes everything. Meditation is turning off society's mind and listening to your own. He also says something unexpected. You can meditate without sitting still. A long walk alone, without a podcast or music, is a form of meditation. Doing the dishes without distraction is a form of meditation. Anything that brings you fully into the present moment with full awareness counts. The goal isn't to empty your mind. The goal is to stop being controlled by it. The ego and its costs. Naval has a fascinating and uncomfortable perspective on the ego. He defines the ego as the story you tell yourself about who you are, the self-image you're constantly protecting and promoting. The ego wants to be right. It wants to be admired. It wants to win arguments. It wants to be seen as successful, intelligent, moral. And it will distort reality, subtly, relentlessly, to protect that self-image. The costs of this are enormous. People stay in bad relationships to avoid admitting failure. They double down on bad investments to avoid admitting error. They dismiss advice that challenges their worldview because accepting it would require revising their self-image. The ego is not your friend. Naval advocates for what he calls killing the ego, which sounds dramatic, but what he means is be willing to be wrong. Be willing to be nobody. Be willing to change your mind completely when the evidence warrants. The people he admires most are those who hold their identities loosely, who can say, "I was wrong about that," without it feeling like a catastrophe, who can change their minds radically without feeling like they've betrayed themselves. This isn't weakness. It's the deepest kind of confidence, the confidence that doesn't need external validation because it comes from inside. Envy, the most useless emotion. Naval has a list of what he calls useless emotions, emotions that consume enormous energy but produce no value. At the top of the list is envy. He points out something that sounds obvious when you hear it, but rarely internalized. You cannot compare your life to someone else's because you don't actually know what their life is like. You see the highlight reel. You don't see the anxiety, the loneliness, the private failures, the relationships that aren't working. Even if someone truly does have everything they appear to have, the money, the status, the beautiful family, that doesn't diminish you. Their having something doesn't take it from you. The universe is not zero-sum. There's a more practical dimension too. Envy is consuming. Every moment you spend wishing you had someone else's life is a moment not spent building your own. It's one of the most expensive emotional habits a person can have. Naval's prescription is deceptively simple. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday,
not to who someone else is today. That's it. That's the whole thing. It sounds obvious. It's also one of the hardest habits to actually form in a world designed to provoke comparison at every moment. The art of not keeping score. Related to envy is the habit of keeping score in relationships, tracking who gave what, who hurt whom, who owes whom. Naval thinks this is corrosive. The best relationships, friendships, partnerships, marriages, operate from a place of genuine generosity. Not tit for tat, not calculation, not expectation. You give because you want to give. You trust that the relationship will balance out over time, and if it doesn't, you let it go. This isn't naivety. It doesn't mean tolerating exploitation. It means choosing relationships where the other person operates from the same spirit of generosity and letting go the ones they don't. The energy wasted on keeping score, the mental accounting, the resentments, the negotiations, could otherwise be spent on creating, loving, living. Naval is very focused on where attention goes because attention is life. Every moment of attention is a moment of your one and only existence.
The present moment as home. Let's get a little philosophical now, because that's where Naval's thinking gets truly interesting. One of his core beliefs is that the present moment is the only place where life actually happens. Not the past, which exists only in memory. Not the future, which exists only in imagination. This moment, right now, is the only real thing. This sounds like a cliché. It isn't, because most of us live almost entirely in either the past or the future. We're processing what happened, or we're planning and worrying about what might happen. We're almost never simply here. Naval draws on contemplative traditions, Buddhism, Stoicism, Vedantic philosophy, that all point to the same truth. Peace is not found by solving the future. It's found by inhabiting the present. He describes the experience of deep presence, of being so absorbed in what you're doing that there's no internal narrator, no running commentary, no wishing things were different, as one of the highest states available to human beings. Athletes call it flow. Meditators call it samadhi. Musicians call it being in the zone. The point is, you can cultivate that experience, not by achieving more, by letting go of more. On death and impermanence. Naval doesn't shy away from death. He thinks about it frequently, not morbidly, but as a clarifying force. There's a tradition in Stoic philosophy of memento mori, remembering that you will die. Not as a cause for despair, but as a reminder to live intentionally, to ask regularly, given that this is finite, what actually matters? Naval says death is liberating when you accept it. Once you fully internalize that everything ends, the relationships, the status, the money, the body, you stop clinging so tightly to things that, in the grand scheme, don't matter. He also says something beautiful. Every night when you fall asleep, you essentially die. You lose consciousness, your sense of self disappears, and every morning a version of you wakes up that feels continuous with the one that went to sleep, but isn't quite the same. This is both unsettling and freeing. Freeing because it means you're not obligated to be the same person tomorrow that you are today. The self is more fluid than we think. You can change. You can let go of old identities. You can begin again. The meaning question. Does life have meaning? Naval's answer is simultaneously humble and profound. He doesn't pretend to know the cosmic answer. He suspects there isn't one, that the universe is indifferent, that consciousness arose by accident, that there's no divine purpose written into the structure of things. But here's the twist. He finds this liberating rather than depressing. If there's no pre-assigned meaning, you get to create meaning, not as a consolation prize, but as a genuine creative act. The meaning you build through the relationships you invest in, the work you do with love,
The experiences you fully inhabit is more real and more personal than any meaning handed to you from outside. He's skeptical of any philosophy or religion that tells you the meaning of life is to follow a specific set of rules, or to serve an institution, or to achieve a predetermined goal. These frameworks outsource your meaning to someone else's vision. His preference: start from honest uncertainty, look clearly at what actually brings you alive, and build your life around that. That's as good as it gets, and he thinks it's very good indeed. On success and contentment. There's a tension at the heart of Naval's worldview that he acknowledges openly. He's deeply ambitious and also deeply committed to peace. These can seem contradictory. His resolution is elegant. You can want things, you can work hard toward them, you can be energized by goals, but your sense of well-being, your fundamental okayness, cannot be contingent on achieving them. In other words, strive fully, but don't suffer when you fall short. Celebrate when you succeed, but don't need it. This is the Stoic ideal of amor fati, love of fate. What happens, happens. Your job is to engage fully, prepare thoroughly, and then accept the outcome with equanimity. The practical result of this is that you actually perform better. When you're not paralyzed by fear of failure, you take better risks. When you're not desperate to win, you negotiate more calmly. When you're not trying to impress anyone, you do your most honest work. Contentment is not the enemy of ambition. Properly understood, it's the precondition for sustainable, joyful ambition.
Let's bring this down to earth. What does this philosophy look like in practice? How does Naval actually live day to day? He said that he tries to avoid things that feel like work. Not because he's lazy, he's famously hard-working, but because if something feels like a chore, it's usually a sign that he's not operating from his genuine strengths and interests. He designs his work life around his specific knowledge and his preferred operating style. He likes to read, think, write, and have deep conversations. He avoids bureaucracy, meetings without purpose, and tasks that could be delegated. He is ruthless about protecting his time and attention. On saying no. One of Naval's most quoted practical pieces of advice is about the power of saying no. Most people have great difficulty saying no. They worry about disappointing people, closing doors, missing opportunities. So they say yes to almost everything, fill their schedule completely, and then wonder why they feel scattered and stressed. Naval's prescription is to say no to almost everything, not rudely, not dismissively, but clearly and without excessive explanation. Here's the logic. The most important things you do require sustained, deep attention. They require flow states. They require time to think and iterate and create. That kind of work is incompatible with a schedule full of commitments. When you say no to one thing, you're saying yes to something else, to your own best work, to your most important relationships, to the activities that genuinely restore your energy. You get paid in the long run for being right, and not for the number of things you try. This applies to more than just meetings and requests. It applies to information. It applies to relationships. It applies to opinions. Learning to say no, gracefully, clearly, habitually, is one of the most practically powerful things you can do. On health. Naval is emphatic about health, not in a fitness-obsessed way, but from a first principles perspective. Your body is the hardware that runs everything else. If the hardware is degraded, nothing else works properly. He's particularly insistent about three things: sleep, exercise, and diet, and he approaches these things with the same framework he applies to everything else. What does the science actually say, stripped of trends and marketing? On sleep, it's probably the single most important health variable for cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and long-term health.
He treats sleep as sacred and is not apologetic about protecting it. On exercise, he prefers activities that feel good to do, walking, weights, whatever you'll actually sustain, over rigid programs you'll abandon after a month. The best workout routine is the one you'll actually do. On diet, he's skeptical of most diet trends and advocates for eating real food, not too much, mostly plants. He's also a proponent of occasional fasting, not for weight loss specifically, but for the cognitive clarity and cellular housekeeping that fasting promotes. He also makes a point about the relationship between physical health and mental health. You cannot think clearly when you're sleep-deprived, malnourished, or chronically sedentary. The mind and body are not separate systems. Taking care of the body is part of taking care of the mind. On relationships. Naval is thoughtful about relationships, and his views are worth sitting with. He talks about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who are honest with you, not just pleasant, but genuinely truthful. Most social environments run on a kind of gentle dishonesty. People say what they think others want to hear. They smooth over conflicts. They avoid hard conversations. The result is that you end up with a distorted picture of reality, and distorted reality leads to bad decisions. He prizes what he calls high-trust relationships, where both parties can say hard things to each other without it threatening the relationship, where disagreement is possible and even welcomed. These relationships are rare and worth cultivating deliberately. He also talks about the importance of shared values in close relationships. Skills and knowledge can be complementary. You want people around you who know things you don't, but values need to be aligned. If you deeply care about honesty and the people around you are comfortable with deception, that fundamental misalignment will create friction no matter how much you like each other. On anger and emotional regulation. Naval says something memorable about anger. It's always the result of thinking the world should be different from how it is. You're stuck in traffic and you're angry. You think the traffic should not be here, but it is here. Your anger doesn't change the traffic, it just ruins your drive. You have a conflict with a colleague and you're angry. You think they should have acted differently. Maybe they should have, but they didn't. Your anger doesn't change what happened. It just consumes your energy. He's not saying never feel anger. He's saying notice when you're angry and ask, what assumption am I making about how the world should be? Is that assumption helping me? Can I update it? This is a muscle. It takes practice. But over time, you start to notice the pattern, anger arising from the collision between expectation and reality. And you can choose consciously whether to fuel the anger or let it pass. He also observes that anger is often masking fear. The aggressive driver who cuts you off isn't evil. They're probably stressed, late, and scared. The difficult colleague who undermines your work probably feels threatened. When you look at the fear underneath the anger, compassion becomes easier, and compassion, paradoxically, is more effective at resolving conflicts.
Time as the ultimate scarce resource. Naval returns frequently to the theme of time, not because he's a productivity guru, but because he's genuinely struck by the strangeness and preciousness of being alive. He has an unusual perspective on wealth that ties directly back to time. The real test of wealth, he says, is not how much money you have, it's how much of your time you own. By this measure, a person who works a job they love with complete schedule flexibility, even if they earn a modest income, is wealthier than a highly paid professional who is owned by their calendar and can never say no to a demand on their time. This reframe changes the goal entirely. The goal isn't to maximize income, the goal is to maximize freedom, starting with the most fundamental freedom of all, which is freedom over your own time. He's deliberately arranged his life to reflect this. He doesn't fill his calendar. He leaves large swaths of unscheduled time, not because he's lazy, but because he knows that his most valuable thinking, creating, and connecting happens in the spaciousness of unscheduled time, not in the frantic busyness of a packed schedule. Retirement as a philosophy. Naval has an interesting definition of retirement. He doesn't think of it as an age or a financial threshold. He defines retirement as the state of not doing anything for money that you wouldn't do for free. Read that again, slowly. If every activity in your professional life is something you would do even if you weren't being paid, because you genuinely love it, because it feeds your curiosity, because it feels meaningful, then you're already retired, regardless of your age or bank account. This is a radical idea. It inverts the conventional relationship between work and leisure. Most people see work as the price you pay for the life you actually want. Naval suggests the goal is to make the work itself the thing you actually want, to close the gap between what you do for money and what you do for love. This is not easy. It may take years of iteration, of trying different things, of honest self-examination, but it's a clearer target than accumulate enough money to stop working, because the latter has a way of receding forever into the future. The vacation test. Here's a practical thought experiment Naval suggests. Ask yourself, when you go on vacation, do you find yourself checking email constantly, eager to get back to work? Or do you decompress slowly, feeling disconnected and restless without your routines? If the answer is the first, if you can't stop working even when you're supposed to be on vacation, that's actually a signal about something important. It might mean you genuinely love what you're doing and find it hard to stop, or it might mean you're addicted to busyness and don't know how to be at peace without it. Learn to tell the difference. The first is sustainable and meaningful. The second is a trap. Naval also says if you're not excited to go back to work after a genuine, restful vacation, you might be in the wrong kind of work. Not because work should always be easy or always feel exciting, but because over the long arc, it should feel like yours, like an expression of who you are, not a sentence you're serving. On boredom and solitude. Naval has a high tolerance for boredom. In fact, he'd argue that boredom is underrated. We live in an age that has essentially eliminated boredom through constant stimulation. Smartphones, streaming, social media, there is now always something to look at, always something to do. The possibility of sitting with nothing, with just yourself and your thoughts, has become genuinely uncommon. Naval thinks this is a problem, not because stimulation is bad per se, but because the capacity for silence and solitude is where deep thinking, creativity, and self-knowledge live. Some of the best ideas in history came to people in moments of apparent idleness. Newton under the apple tree, Archimedes in the bath. These weren't accidents. Unfocused attention has a different quality than focused attention. It makes connections and synthesizes patterns in ways that concentrated effort doesn't. He recommends deliberate boredom. Put down the phone, turn off the podcast, sit with your thoughts. Go for a walk without a destination. Let your mind wander. At first, this is uncomfortable. The monkey mind complains loudly about the absence of stimulation. But give it time. The mind, like a shaken snow globe, will gradually settle. And in that settling, something valuable becomes visible. Here's a part of Naval's worldview that surprises many people. He takes spirituality seriously. Not in a religious, institutional sense. He's not advocating for any tradition in particular, but in the sense that he believes there are dimensions of experience and consciousness that our ordinary, everyday mind doesn't have access to. He's deeply interested in questions that science can't currently answer. What is consciousness? Why does anything exist rather than nothing? Is the self, as we experience it, real? Or is it a story the brain tells itself? He approaches these questions empirically and humbly. He doesn't claim to have answers. He finds the uncertainty fascinating rather than terrifying. His meditation practice has given him experiential glimpses of states that he finds difficult to describe in ordinary language, moments of pure awareness without the usual narrative of self, without the usual division between observer and observed. He takes these experiences seriously as data points, even if he can't fit them neatly into a scientific framework. The self as illusion and why it matters. One of the mind-bending ideas Naval engages with is the possibility that the self, that solid, continuous I you feel yourself to be, is, in some deep sense, a construction. This is not a new idea. Buddhist philosophy has been saying it for 2,500 years. Modern neuroscience is increasingly finding evidence for something similar, that the sense of a unified self is assembled moment by the brain, rather than being a fixed, pre-existing thing. Why does this matter practically? Because a lot of our suffering is tied to protecting and promoting this self. We're defensive because criticism feels like an attack on me. We're envious because someone else's success feels like a diminishment of me. We're afraid of death because death feels like the annihilation of me. If the self is lighter, more fluid, more provisional than we thought, if it's something like a process rather than a thing, then many of these sources of suffering become less heavy. You can disagree with an idea without feeling personally attacked. You can witness someone else's success with genuine pleasure rather than envy. You can contemplate your own eventual death with more peace. This isn't about eliminating the self, it's about holding it more lightly. Nature as a source of perspective. Naval mentions, in various interviews, the importance of spending time in nature, not as a recreational activity, but as a perspective-generating practice. There's something about the scale of nature, mountains, oceans, forests, night skies, that recalibrates human concerns in a useful way. The problems that feel urgent and enormous in the context of your life in your city look rather different when you're standing in front of something that has existed for millions of years and will exist for millions more. He's not advocating escapism. He's advocating perspective. The ability to hold your own problems lightly, to see them as important but not cosmically significant, is both more accurate and more conducive to clear thinking than treating every challenge as a crisis. Nature also reminds you that you are biological. You are animal in the best sense, a creature with a body that evolved over billions of years, exquisitely designed to be in the world, not just thinking about it. Getting outside, moving your body, breathing outdoor air, these are not luxuries. They're fundamental to well-being in a way that our increasingly indoor, screen-mediated lives tends to obscure. Part 9. The Integration. Wealth and Happiness Together. Why both matter. We've covered a lot of ground. Wealth, happiness, mental models, spiritual dimensions. Let's bring it all together. Naval's core thesis, if you had to distill it into one sentence, might be this: build enough wealth to be free, and build enough inner peace to enjoy that freedom. Without both, something is missing. Without wealth, without the freedom to control your time and resources, you're at the mercy of others' needs and systems. You can be a deeply enlightened person with no ability to act on what you value. That's a kind of spiritual prison. Without happiness, without inner peace, equanimity, the ability to be present and at ease, wealth becomes a distraction. You accumulate to fill a void, and the void doesn't fill. You build a bigger house, but can't sit quietly in any room of it. That's a different kind of prison. The goal is both, not either or. And crucially, Naval argues they're not in conflict. They reinforce each other. When you're genuinely at peace, you make better decisions. You're not driven by fear or desperation. You can take smart long-term risks because you're not in a panic about short-term outcomes.
You attract better partners because your inner calm is visible and reassuring. And when you have genuine financial freedom, the practices that cultivate happiness become more accessible. You can invest in your health. You can choose your environment. You can structure your time around what matters to you. You can afford to say no. The flywheel effect. Naval describes what we might call a flywheel, a self-reinforcing loop where positive changes in one area generate momentum in others. You start exercising, your sleep improves. Better sleep improves your mood and cognitive function. Better cognitive function means you make better decisions. Better decisions compound into better outcomes in work and relationships. Better outcomes reduce stress. Less stress means better sleep. The same flywheel operates on the financial and psychological dimensions of his framework. As you build specific knowledge and leverage, you earn more with less time. More free time means more capacity to read, reflect, and cultivate inner peace. More inner peace means less reactive decision-making. Less reactive decision-making means better investments and partnerships. Better partnerships accelerate wealth building. The catch, of course, is getting the flywheel started. The hardest part is always the beginning, before the compounding kicks in, when you're putting in energy and seeing limited results. Naval is patient and realistic about this. He doesn't promise quick wins. He promises that the direction is right and that patience will be rewarded. The most important question. As we move toward the end of this journey, I want to pause on a question that Naval returns to again and again in different forms. What do you actually want? Not what your parents want for you, not what your culture has told you to want, not what your colleagues are competing for. What do you actually want when you're honest with yourself, stripped of performance and pretension and social comparison? This question sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult to answer honestly. Most of us have spent so long pursuing socially approved goals, the degree, the job title, the salary, the house, the status, that we've lost touch with our own genuine desires. We've internalized other people's definitions of success so completely that we can't easily distinguish them from our own. Naval says the work of finding yourself, and by that he means finding your genuine values, your authentic desires, your actual preferences, is among the most important work you can do, not as a luxury or an indulgence, but as a prerequisite for building a life that will actually satisfy you. Because you can achieve someone else's vision of success completely, all the credentials, all the accolades, all the money, and still feel hollow. And you can achieve something modest by conventional standards that is exactly right for you and feel genuinely fulfilled. The difference is in the alignment between what you're doing and who you actually are. Naval is not particularly conventional philanthropist. He doesn't talk much about donating money to causes, but he does talk a great deal about the responsibility to share what you've learned. If you've figured something out about health, about happiness, about wealth, about how the world works, you have a kind of obligation to share it. Not to lecture, not to preach, but to make what you've learned available for others who are on a similar path. This book is, in a sense, an expression of that impulse. Naval has given away enormous amounts of his thinking for free, on Twitter, in podcasts, in interviews. Not a self-promotion, but because he genuinely believes that ideas are worth sharing. He also talks about the importance of being useful to people in your immediate circle, not abstractly useful, not theoretically generous, but concretely helpful to the actual people in your life who need what you have to offer. The quiet revolution. There's something quietly revolutionary about Naval's worldview. In a culture that worships busyness, he champions stillness. In a world that equates worth with productivity, he values presence. In an economy that rewards conformity, he bets everything on specificity. He's not anti-ambition, he's anti-suffering. He's not against success, he's against making your peace contingent on achieving it. This is at its core a philosophy of liberation, not from the world, but from the patterns of thought that make the world feel like a prison. And it's a philosophy that respects your intelligence. Naval doesn't tell you what to want or how to live. He offers frameworks, observations, hard-won insights. He assumes you're capable of thinking for yourself and applying these ideas to your specific life. That assumption of your intelligence and autonomy